The Garden of Eleanor, 1842, Devonshire. If you had walked along the eastern edge of Devonshire in the early spring of 1842, you might have passed an old stone gate, covered in ivy, slightly ajar. And through that gate, past a narrow gravel path, was the Garden of Eleanor. It was not a large garden, nor particularly well kept, but it was gentle. The earth was soft. The roses, although few, leaned forward slightly in the morning wind. The bench beneath the old apple tree, with its crooked armrest, had grown moss around the legs, and every morning, without fail, Eleanor sat there. Wrapped in a pale lavender shawl, a cup of weak tea in her hand, she would wait. They say that Eleanor was a quiet woman, not shy, not loud, simply fond of silence. She had known Thomas for 3 years, not in the way stories usually tell love, not in grand declarations or wild passions, but in soft moments and shared habits. He was a gardener's apprentice. His hands were always stained with soil. His boots were always damp from the dew. Every morning, as he passed through the garden gate, he would lift his hand in a small wave. Eleanor would nod. Sometimes she smiled. Sometimes she simply looked at him. But always, she waited. In the year 1842, people still wrote letters by hand on heavy cream-colored paper. The ink was black and took time to dry. Most people sealed their letters with wax. Eleanor preferred dark green wax, pressed with a small pressed flower. She wrote to Thomas every Sunday. Even though they lived only a short walk apart, it was the custom. They liked the slowness of it. He would read her letters under the candlelight in his small rented room. And sometimes, in the morning, he would quote a line back to her in passing. Not loud, just enough for her to hear as he walked by the bench. "The roses are soft this year," he said once. She looked at him. "That was what you wrote?" he said again, not stopping. "And you were right." On Tuesdays, Eleanor visited the lace market. She wore gloves with pearl buttons, a style that had gone slightly out of fashion, but she liked them. She always returned with a small satchel of thread, a bit of lavender soap, and sometimes a tin of boiled sweets. She gave the sweets to the local children. And Thomas, well, he liked the soap. He said it reminded him of summer and his mother's linen closet. There is no record of Eleanor and Thomas ever being engaged. There was no proposal, no written document. But those who knew them said their bond was clearer than most. If you had stood near the iron fence just before dusk, you might have seen Thomas lean his spade against the old tool shed, and Eleanor would rise from her bench slowly, her hand still holding a folded handkerchief. They would walk, not far, just to the edge of the garden, near the small bird bath that hadn't held water in years. They would stand there, side by side, in silence, until the bell from the church chimed 7 times. By May, the wisteria had bloomed across the trellis. Its lavender flowers drooped like sleepy heads, fragrant and slow. Eleanor tied a ribbon to one of the vines, a habit her mother had taught her. "For wishes," she said. She did not say what she wished for, but the ribbon was soft blue, and it swayed each evening as the wind curled through the garden gate. Thomas sometimes brought books, old poetry, never too long. One evening, he read her a poem about waiting, and she closed her eyes. "When you wait without time," he whispered, "even the sky becomes your friend." She did not answer. He didn't mind. In 1842, most people in Devonshire still used beeswax candles. They were warm and yellow, and their scent filled small houses like bread in the oven. Eleanor's cottage smelled like that, wax and dried lavender. And just before bed, she would open the window and look outside. Sometimes she saw him walking home, his lamp swinging like a quiet star. And sometimes she didn't. But always she waited. Even the neighbors noticed. She sits there each day, they said, but they never interfered. Because there was something peaceful about the way she waited. Not urgent, not sad, just certain. The garden still exists. The bench is gone and the apple tree has been replaced. But if you walk quietly and the wind is soft, you might hear the whisper of two people who never needed to speak much. They were not dramatic. They were not famous. They were simply fond of one another. And in the quiet hours before nightfall, they walked and waited and wrote. And now you rest, just like Eleanor did, with the scent of lavender and the soft hum of bees. You are walking through that garden too, aren't you? One foot on the gravel, one glance toward the vine-covered archway. The light is fading, and the silence is full of love. Just stay here, just breathe, just rest. The Bookshop Letters of Vienna, 1871. If you had stepped into the narrow, cobbled alley of West Mariengasse in Vienna in the winter of 1871, you might have noticed a small bookshop with a fading green awning, slightly tilted from years of snow. The sign, delicately hand-painted in gold, read, "Leopold's Antiquarian Books and Paper." Inside, it always smelled faintly of pressed violets, glue, and candle smoke. That winter was especially uneventful. The snow came gently, without bluster or urgency. It gathered on rooftops like forgotten lace, and the street lamps flickered quietly under the weight of it all. In the shop, behind the long walnut counter, sat a man named Otto. He was 39 years old and preferred soft-spoken afternoons to grand conversations. Otto wore heavy wool coats, always brown, and a pair of round spectacles that magnified his eyes just slightly. His voice was low and velvety, like the rustle of parchment. One day in January, a letter arrived. Not for the store, but for Otto. It was addressed in neat, flowing handwriting on thick cream paper, the ink slightly faded by time. The envelope smelled faintly of lavender. No return name, only, "To Otto at the bookshop." He opened it slowly, as if unsealing a season. The letter read, "I saw you once when the lilacs were still in bloom. You were reading aloud to a child about ancient rivers. I often pass your shop. You do not know me, but I know you are quiet." Otto folded the letter 3 times and placed it gently inside an old edition of the Sonnets of Petrarch. Weeks passed, then another letter, and then another. Each note was modest, thoughtful. They were always signed with a simple E. Nothing dramatic, only gentle musings. "I wonder if you prefer autumn dusk or spring dawn. I imagine your hands smell faintly of ink and cedar. Today I wore a dress the color of paper." By February, Otto began to leave responses, handwritten, quiet, and left inside a volume by the door labeled "Reserved for E." He didn't know who she was, and he did not ask. The mystery never bloomed into excitement, only into comfort, familiarity, a kind of sleepwalking affection. Otto wrote things like, "Today I cleaned the window. The frost patterns reminded me of lace. I've placed a new lamp by the Italian poets. The light is kinder. Your notes remind me of the way tea cools beside a forgotten novel." The customers remained few. The silence remained whole. And so it continued. Each week, a note tucked in an old book. each week a small answer left behind in kind. They never met. They never needed to. By March, the letters sometimes stopped mid-sentence, as if the writer had fallen asleep while writing them. Otto once wrote, "When the lilacs return, I will think of your voice in ink." And indeed, when spring crept back, softly like a memory, the lilacs did bloom again. It never revealed herself, and Otto never pressed. Some say even years later, he kept a drawer of all the letters, tied with soft blue ribbon, and read them aloud on quiet evenings, each syllable like a lullaby. If you had wandered by the bookshop one pale morning in April, you might have heard him whispering those words beneath his breath to no one and to someone. And then, slowly, the candle would flicker, the paper would rest, and silence would resume. Candles in the Quiet Court, 1689, Bruges. If you had wandered through Bruges in the winter of 1689, you might have found a narrow alley paved with cold cobblestones, still damp from the morning frost. The street would be quiet, hushed as if time had chosen to whisper instead of speak. And at the end of that alley, a small court, enclosed on all sides by ivy-covered stone walls. A court where candles glowed at every window, even in the daylight. That was where Lisette lived. Lisette kept a candle shop. Not a large one, not particularly busy, but warm. The air always smelled of beeswax and orange peel. She carved the candles by hand, some tall and smooth, others small with tiny ridges, meant for prayer. She sold most of them to quiet passers-by, but some she gave away without saying much. One of those candles, a thin ivory taper, found its way into the hands of Willem. Willem was a letter scribe. He wrote for people who could not. In 1689, not all townsfolk could read, but letters still needed to be sent. Willem's writing was neat, deliberate, and always ended with a flourish of ink. He set up his desk beside the fountain in the court, where pigeons fluttered and children rolled small hoops. Each morning, Lisette watched him from her window. She didn't speak. She just watched. She liked how he lined up his inkwells, how he wiped his quill, how he always read each letter twice before folding it. And once, only once, she saw him pause, close his eyes, and light one of her candles beside the parchment. It was cold that winter, colder than the last. Lisette began placing a candle on the windowsill each evening, just one. Sometimes tall, sometimes short, but always lit just before the hour turned 6. Willem noticed. He began timing his walk so he'd pass just as the candle was being lit. "A flame in this quiet place," he once murmured aloud, half to himself, like a sigh that glows. She didn't answer, but the next evening she lit 2. In Bruges, tea was rare in 1689. Coffee was more common. Willem brought her roasted beans in a cloth sack one morning, along with a page of poetry. He didn't say it was for her, but it was. They sat on opposite benches, not touching, just sipping and listening to the pigeons' wings. Lisette read the poem silently. It was about candlelight, about how flames lean toward what they love. That year, snow came early. The court filled with a pale hush. Lisette wrapped her shop in linens and lace, old cloths her mother had hemmed. She carved candles in the shape of bells and stars, with little dots like snowflakes along their sides. Willem began bringing her ink. He said she might want to write something someday. She didn't. Not yet. But she liked the idea. If you had stood in that court, the old townsfolk would say, you'd have seen 2 people who said very little and understood everything. No records show they ever married. No paintings, no signed declarations. But a small book was found years later in the attic of a home nearby. It was filled with poems, none signed, each describing the light of a candle. And beside one poem, tucked between the pages, was a pressed orange peel. In those days, clocks ticked slower, or so it seemed. Lisette and Willem continued their routine. One candle at dusk, one glance exchanged, one walk across the court. They never hurried. There was no need. If you had paused at the corner of that alley, around the hour of 7, you might have seen a flicker of gold on the stone walls. Two shadows leaning near each other. No voices, just the sound of snow melting under soft boots. And now, as you rest, let the light of their story dim in your mind. Soft candlelight, flickering just for you. The air is cool but not cold. The court is silent but not lonely. You are walking there too. You can feel the stone beneath your feet, the scent of beeswax in the air, the glow of something gentle, just behind your closed eyes. Stay here. No need to move. Let the court hold you. Let the candles flicker softly, and let your breath slow, like the tick of a quiet clock in 1689. If you had walked beneath the long red gates of Nara in the spring of 1765, you might have heard the slow toll of the afternoon temple bell. It rang once, then paused, then rang again. Not in urgency, just in rhythm, as if it were breathing. The bell was heard most clearly from the far side of the plum orchard. Beyond that, a footbridge. And beyond the bridge, a small tea house, nearly hidden by cherry trees. That is where Aiko lived. Aiko served tea to monks, to travelers, to the occasional poet who wished to write in the shadow of a willow. She never rushed. She moved with the silence of paper lanterns, and each day, at the fourth bell of the afternoon, she prepared a second cup of tea. She placed it beside the edge of the bridge on a wooden tray. For years, she did this. It was always the same cup. Porcelain, with a small blue crane painted on the inside rim. The tea, always sakura blossom, and the steam would rise briefly before fading into the soft breeze. No one knew why Aiko left the second cup. Some said it was for a traveler she once met. Others said it was for a painter who had long since gone. But Aiko? She simply smiled when asked and said, "Some guests arrive without footsteps." In the spring of 1765, a man named Haru arrived in Nara. He was a calligrapher from the north, quiet, with hands always stained faintly with ink. He wore simple robes and carried only a cloth bundle and a small wooden flute. The first time he saw the teacup on the bridge, he did not drink. He only bowed. Aiko saw him from the tea house window. The next day, the cup was there again, and so was he. He bowed again, deeper this time, and sat. Not close, not far, just near enough for the silence to feel shared. In Nara, rain falls gently in spring. It does not rush. It lingers. Haru returned each day with the bell. He never spoke first. Sometimes he would write a word on a folded piece of paper and leave it beside the tray. Words like stillness, crane, wait, moon. Aiko kept the papers in a lacquered box. She never replied, not in words, but one day she left a folded napkin on the tray. Inside, a pressed cherry blossom. The court musicians said the tea house had become quieter. Even the wind seemed to hush as it passed. Aiko began playing soft music during the final hour before dusk. A single stringed koto, its sound light as silk. Haru sometimes played his flute in answer. not a song, just notes like footsteps through fog. And together, without ever arranging it, they made music no one else heard. In 1765, paper lanterns in Nara were made by hand, using mulberry bark and thin bamboo frames. Aiko hung 3 each night, one by the door, one at the bridge, and one on the tree, where the bell's sound echoed best. She said the lanterns kept memories from drifting away too fast. Haru began painting them in secret. Small brushstrokes, mountains, cranes, a single line of poetry around the rim. When she saw them, she didn't speak. She only lit them gently. There are no tales of Aiko and Haru exchanging vows. No grand poetry survived, except what was written in silence. But some say, if you stand by that bridge now, at the same hour the bell rings, you may still feel the warmth of tea left for someone who always arrived quietly. And now, as your breath slows, let the bell echo in your chest, once, then again, like a memory without beginning or end. You're crossing the bridge softly. The wooden planks creak beneath your feet, but gently, they know you are there. A cup of tea waits for you. Steam curls, not to vanish, but to welcome you home. Sit, rest. You have no words to say, and none are needed. You are part of the silence now. Postcards from the olive grove. If you had walked along the hillside paths of Tuscany in the summer of 1934, you might have passed a grove of olive trees, dry silver green, rustling like soft paper in the warm air. The soil beneath him was dusty and warm, and nestled between 2 hills, where the land folded like a page in an old book, was a house with faded blue shutters and a crooked red chimney. That was where Emilia lived. Emilia lived alone, but not unhappily. She made soap from olive oil and hung herbs to dry beneath the wooden beams. She wrote postcards too, dozens of them, every month. Not to anyone in particular, just to the idea of someone. She never addressed them. She never mailed them. She kept them in a shoebox tied with a yellow ribbon. On the front, she drew little scenes in pencil. A jug of water on a stone windowsill, a cat curled in the shade of a chair, a bicycle with one bent wheel. Simple things. And on the back, always the same line. It was quiet today. You would have liked it. One morning in July, a young man named Marco arrived in the valley. He was a mapmaker's apprentice. He carried measuring sticks, notebooks, and a satchel full of pencils. He was looking for the oldest well in the area. It was rumored to be near the olive grove. He stopped at Emilia's house to ask for water. She gave him a glass and a piece of peach. He stayed until dusk. In 1934, postcards were often printed with bright colors, beach umbrellas, grand hotels, cathedrals. But Emilia's were quiet, faded, muted, sleepy. Marco asked to see more, so she showed him the shoebox. He looked at each one slowly, tracing the pencil lines with care. Then he said, "These are not just drawings, they're waiting." She didn't answer, but the next morning she drew one of him, leaning over a crooked stone well, sunlight on his back. She tucked it into the box behind the others. They began spending afternoons together. No plans, no hurry. She would sort herbs, thyme, rosemary, lavender, tying them into bundles. He would map tree roots and broken paths, measuring the space between things. They didn't speak much, but they laughed sometimes. And once, they napped on opposite sides of a fig tree. "I dreamed I missed you," Marco said, half asleep. "But I wasn't gone," she replied. By August, the grapes were nearly ripe. The valley smelled of stone and sun and ripened fruit. They picked figs together and watched bees float between the vines. Sometimes he would write something in his notebook, then tear the page out and place it on her windowsill. One said, "Even when I leave, the olives will remember where we sat." Emilia never asked him to stay, and Marco never said if he would. But each time he packed to leave, he unpacked again. Just one more day, one more drawing, one more silent lunch beneath the walnut tree. In the attic of a farmhouse in Tuscany, many years later, someone found a shoebox of postcards, faded and dusty, each with a small pencil drawing, and always on the back. It was quiet today. You would have liked it. But one, only one, had a different line. It said, "He stayed," and it stayed quiet. And now, you are walking in that grove. The soil is warm beneath your bare feet. The olives move like soft sighs in the trees above you. You find a stone wall and sit. There's a postcard waiting beside you. It doesn't ask anything. It only says, "You are here." And that is enough. Breathe. The sunlight is golden. The shadows are long. The breeze is soft, and the story is still being written. Let your thoughts drift like leaves. Let the silence hold you. Let the olive trees remember for you. Sleep. A lantern lit in St. Ives, 1877 Cornwall. If you had stood on the stone pier of St. Ives in the autumn of 1877, you might have seen a single lantern glowing from the window of a small house near the cliff's edge. It flickered, not with urgency, but with steadiness, like a heartbeat left on a windowsill. That house belonged to Clara. Clara was the lighthouse keeper's daughter. Not much happened in her days. She tended to the garden, shelled peas, mended scarves, and kept the books her father never read. She knew the tide schedule better than the calendar. She spoke little, but every evening she lit the same lantern at the same hour and placed it by the same window. It faced the sea, and sometimes the sea answered. In late October of that year, a man arrived by rowboat. His name was Edwin. He was quiet, with salt in his beard and a long notebook wrapped in oilcloth. He was not from the town, only passing through, though no one knew where from. The waves had tipped his boat. The townspeople helped him ashore. Clara brought him tea. "Is the lantern for someone?" he asked her that evening, seeing the light. She said, "It's for anyone." Edwin stayed in the guest cottage near the docks. He walked the cliffs each morning. He carried a small brass compass and sometimes spoke aloud to himself, though softly, like someone reading a poem no one else needed to hear. Clara began leaving a second teacup outside the front door. He never took it directly, but it was always empty by morning. The lantern continued glowing. One night, the fog was heavy, and she considered not lighting it. But she did anyway. Later, she found a note under a shell on the porch. Some lights don't guide ships. They wait, just in case. They began walking together slowly, along the cliffs, not far. She would pick sea glass. He would sketch boats with charcoal. They didn't talk about their lives, just about the weather, and sometimes about stars. One evening, he pointed to the sky and said, "They look like pinholes in an old map." She said nothing, but the next day, she gave him a scrap of parchment with dots poked gently into it. In St. Ives, blankets were often made from rough wool. Clara had one, grey with blue stripes, that she always brought to the rocks. Edwin added a corner of his coat. They sat, two shadows against the sky, sharing warmth, saying little. There was no kiss, no handheld, no vow, just presence. By December, the sea was louder, winds came faster, but the lantern stayed. And one morning, Clara found a package on her step, Edwin's notebook. Inside, sketches of her garden, her lantern, the shape of her boots, the teacup, and on the last page, "When you light the lantern, I know the world hasn't ended." She lit it that night, and every night after. No one knows where Edwin went. The boat was gone. The compass was left behind, pointing always toward her window. Many years later, a traveler in St. Ives noted a light in a high window, even though the house was said to be empty. When asked, the villagers said, "It's always been there, since before we can remember, just in case someone needs to know." They were seen. Now, you're walking by the edge of the sea. The wind is soft and steady. The tide is low. A lantern flickers far ahead. You don't need to hurry. It's waiting. It always has been. Breathe in the salt. Feel the stone beneath your steps. Let the wind carry the silence around you. No endings, no questions, just light and rest. You are there now, and you are home. The Clockmaker's Porch in Lisbon in 1774. If you had strolled through the narrow, uneven streets of Lisbon in the summer of 1774, you might have heard the soft ticking of 100 clocks echoing faintly from the corner of Rua das Flores. The sound was not hurried. It was not loud. It was the patient, practiced rhythm of time moving slowly, as if each moment stretched itself politely into the next. At the very edge of the district stood a little whitewashed building, trimmed with pale green shutters and vines. The house belonged to a clockmaker named Tommaso. He was quiet, as most clockmakers are, and his days were spent tuning brass gears and polishing walnut cases. The clocks were never urgent. They were built for homes that valued the gentle awareness of time, not the command of it. Each evening, as the sun dipped into the river, Tommaso would sit on his wooden porch, beneath a hanging lantern that was never quite bright. He wore a brown waistcoat, faded from sun and oil, and always carried a linen cloth in his lap. From this porch, he would sip weak tea and listen to the soft clinking of the harbor in the distance. That summer, a woman named Sophia began to pass by his home. She was the niece of a nearby textile merchant. She wore long skirts that whispered against the cobblestones and carried a small book always tied with string. On Thursdays, she paused. It was always Thursday. Tommaso noticed it first in her shoes, a shade of grey-green that matched the porch trim. Then in her glance, always slow, never hurried, like the minute hand of a forgotten mantel clock. One Thursday, Sophia spoke. "Do they all tick the same?" Tommaso looked up. Not at all. Some whisper, some mutter, a few barely bother. And that was the start. Each Thursday, Sophia would stop and sit on the edge of the porch, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. They spoke softly about mechanical things. She asked about pendulums and balance wheels, though she never quite remembered the answers. Tommaso explained how brass changed tone with humidity and how wood expanded in winter. These were not thrilling facts. They were the kind that rested gently in the mind and asked for nothing more. One evening, Tommaso gave her a small watch. It had no numbers, only tiny stars on the dial. "It's not for time," he said, "just for remembering." Sophia never wound it. She kept it in a drawer lined with lavender paper. Years later, she would open it and listen for the ticking, though none ever came. If you had walked past the porch in 1774, you might have seen them. The clockmaker and the girl with the unwound watch, sitting in the slow light of a Lisbon dusk, speaking quietly of springs and cogs, and nothing much at all. The vines would have rustled softly, the river would have sighed, and the clocks inside would keep ticking, gently, endlessly, into the calm. The Button Shop beneath the Opera House, 1853. The candlelight flickered just above the wooden shelf of antique buttons, each one whispering a forgotten story of velvet coats and corseted gowns. Beneath the grand Paris Opera House, just past the iron door, no patron noticed, stood a shop so still, so quiet, it may as well have existed only in dreams. Madame Ruelle, the button keeper, had hair like braided smoke and eyes that blinked slower than time itself. Her fingers moved silently across trays of mother of pearl, brass, and jet black glass. If you listened long enough, she'd tell you about the soldier who once traded his medal for a single silver clasp, or the ballet dancer who lost a jade button sewn into her slippers the night she disappeared behind the velvet curtain. The shop never closed, though no one saw it open. Visitors wandered in only when lost or heartbroken. Some left with buttons, others with dreams stitched a little tighter. The quiet hum of the city above never reached the shop's air. Only the soft echo of fabric brushing fabric and Madame's gentle sighs. One shelf, it said, held a box that hummed when touched, a sound like a lullaby from another century. It was said to belong to a young composer who loved a ballerina he could never meet. Each note he wrote was sewn into buttons he left in Madame's care. She never sold them, only dusted them every Wednesday. And the clock struck something. Maybe midnight, maybe not, but time, inside that shop, curled into a sleepy loop. Dreams swayed like hanging coats, and Madame Ruelle, ever patient, watched a moth land gently on a velvet collar. Here's the next chapter. Tea with Mr. Pembroke at the Mossy Hill, 1811. If you had wandered through the fog-kissed hills of Surrey in the spring of 1811, you might have found yourself on a gently curving path lined with hedgerows, each leaf dewed with morning calm. Moss grew in patches along the old stone fences, softening every edge, and the air was heavy with the perfume of wet earth and the distant scent of brewing tea. Atop one such hill stood a weathered cottage, painted the palest ivory, where Mr. Pembroke, a widowed gentleman of quiet reputation, hosted his late afternoon teas. He wore spectacles not for need, but for habit, and his hands, though still, trembled ever so slightly when he poured the tea from a porcelain pot he had acquired during a mild trip to Dover in 1798. The year 1811 was known in certain circles not for political shifts, but for the popularity of lavender-infused jam and lemon-dusted scones. In Mr. Pembroke's company, however, such details mattered very little. Each Thursday, he set 2 cups instead of 1, and sat across from the empty chair as though expecting someone faintly remembered. The someone was Miss Delilah Raines, a governess who had once lived 2 villages over. She wore grey shawls and preferred bread without butter. For nearly a year, they had exchanged short, handwritten notes left in a hollow tree near the duck pond. In them, they spoke only of the weather, the birds, and their favorite tea varieties. Nothing ever stirred beyond those topics. If you had visited one such Thursday, one might say softly, you would have seen Mr. Pembroke reading slowly from a book of garden essays, pausing every so often to refill a cup that remained untouched. Time moved slowly here. The biscuits crumbled gently. The fire cracked in the hearth without urgency. Mr. Pembroke never expected Delilah to return, but he continued the ritual, allowing his heart to remain suspended in the rhythm of what might have been. Some say he once walked to her village, only to stop halfway when the rain began.
He waited under an elm tree for 2 hours, then returned home, soaked, saying only, "The sky was kind today." By 6:43 p.m., he would often rise, fold the napkins, and hum the same tune Delilah once whistled while examining seed packets in the market. It was, by all accounts, a hauntingly uneventful melody, and so each Thursday faded like the ones before, a gentle echo of what never truly began, the forgotten letters of Eleanor Blythe, 1782. Somewhere deep in the folds of Wiltshire's slow-whispering countryside, in a crumbling carriage house behind the Blythe family estate, there sat an ironwood chest. Its hinges had rusted into silence, and its corners were lined with velvet moth-chewed trim. Inside were 147 unopened letters, all addressed to a woman named Eleanor Blythe, whose name barely survives the records of time. It is believed she was born in 1757, though some parish notes suggest 1759. She was known to wear pale blue dresses with overly long sleeves, always hiding her hands when she spoke, as though her fingers harbored secrets too personal for the light. Her fondness for rose-flavored pastries and stargazing from the roof was once considered peculiar in polite society. The letters were sent over the course of 2 decades, 1782 to 1801, by a man identified only by his initials, J.M. He never used full names. He never referred to places. His ink was always brown, as if he brewed his own. Every envelope bore a single pressed fern. That detail became so routine that even Eleanor began to expect the fern more than the words inside. But the strange part, what made this story so dreamy and indeed dull in the loveliest way, is that Eleanor never opened a single letter. She kept them tied with twine, stored by season. "Spring correspondences," she once wrote in her diary, "smell sweeter, though autumns seem heavier." Many have speculated as to why she didn't read them. Some say she feared disappointment. Others claim she believed the mystery was more romantic than the truth. Eleanor was fond of possibilities after all. Once she spent 7 years painting imaginary maps of cities that didn't exist. By 1793, villagers recalled seeing her sitting by the window at dusk, holding a letter up to the light, her eyes skimming its seal, never its contents. When her cousin asked why, she simply said, "Knowing there's something there is enough for now." The final letter arrived in December 1801. She placed it atop the stack, untied it, then gently tied them all back together with a thicker ribbon, blue velvet. When Eleanor passed in 1810, the letters remained untouched, not a single seal broken, not a single word read. A historian once read them all in 1937 and published a study titled "Love Deferred, the Blythe Mystery." But the book was so full of footnotes and weather context that most readers fell asleep before reaching chapter 2. And so Eleanor's unopened romance lingers, not in passion or heartbreak, but in the silence of possibilities, unchosen, unread, and unspoiled. Here is Tea Leaves and Ink Stains, The Courting Rituals of Colonial Madras, 1789. The monsoons had just kissed the edges of Fort St. George in Madras in 1789, when a curious English custom began blooming among the palm-lined verandas of the East India Company settlement: teacup courting. A practice so gentle and repetitive, so unhurried and utterly predictable, that even its participants often forgot they were courting at all. It began with a porcelain cup, delivered each morning to the garden of a particular bungalow owned by the Percival sisters, Margaret and Edith. The cup would rest on a saucer precisely 11 centimeters in diameter, always placed facing east. Inside was a folded note, written in indigo ink on handmade linen paper. Not poetic declarations of love, no, just questions like, "Do you suppose crows feel jealousy? Have you ever wept over a compass? Is cardamom a comfort or an intrusion?" These questions were never signed. The handwriting, however, betrayed its author, a young assistant mapmaker named Lionel Tisbury, whose lowercase g's curved like sea waves and whose ink occasionally smudged where his fingers trembled. Every morning for 147 days, the teacup arrived. Every evening, One of the Percival sisters, never revealing which, would leave a reply in the same cup on slightly thinner paper, often accompanied by a dried petal or half of a clove. Their handwriting was always printed in block letters to mask their identity. By day 52, Lionel asked whether stars could be forgiven for being late. By day 79, the sisters responded, "Only if they whisper apologies." The entire affair became known among house staff and nearby traders as the slowest romance on earth. But no one intervened. In fact, many encouraged it by polishing the cup or trimming the hedge near the garden to give the suitor more space. The romance unfolded entirely through these small exchanges, without names, faces, or direct contact. For nearly 5 months, their intimacy grew, measured not in glances or touches, but in the precise language of folded paper and cautious curiosity. On day 148, the cup did not arrive. No note, no question, just the cup, upside down and inside it. A simple seashell, smoothed by years in the tide. The sisters never wrote again. Lionel, as recorded in a logbook from the map office, took leave for health of spirit and returned to England, where he eventually became a lighthouse keeper. It is said he kept the last seashell on his desk until the day he died, and thus ends another chapter in romantic history, where the heartbeat of love was barely audible, the tea always slightly oversteeped, and the climax never quite arrived. He waited under an elm tree for 2 hours, then returned home, soaked, saying only, "The sky was kind today." By 6:43 p.m., he would often rise, fold the napkins, and hum the same tune Delilah once whistled while examining seed packets in the market. It was, by all accounts, a hauntingly uneventful melody, and so each Thursday faded like the ones before, a gentle echo of what never truly began, the forgotten letters of Eleanor Blythe, 1782. Somewhere deep in the folds of Wiltshire's slow-whispering countryside, in a crumbling carriage house behind the Blythe family estate, there sat an ironwood chest. Its hinges had rusted into silence, and its corners were lined with velvet moth-chewed trim. Inside were 147 unopened letters, all addressed to a woman named Eleanor Blythe, whose name barely survives the records of time. It is believed she was born in 1757, though some parish notes suggest 1759. She was known to wear pale blue dresses with overly long sleeves, always hiding her hands when she spoke, as though her fingers harbored secrets too personal for the light. Her fondness for rose-flavored pastries and stargazing from the roof was once considered peculiar in polite society. The letters were sent over the course of 2 decades, 1782 to 1801, by a man identified only by his initials, J.M. He never used full names. He never referred to places. His ink was always brown, as if he brewed his own. Every envelope bore a single pressed fern. That detail became so routine that even Eleanor began to expect the fern more than the words inside. But the strange part, what made this story so dreamy and indeed dull in the loveliest way, is that Eleanor never opened a single letter. She kept them tied with twine, stored by season. "Spring correspondences," she once wrote in her diary, "smell sweeter, though autumns seem heavier." Many have speculated as to why she didn't read them. Some say she feared disappointment. Others claim she believed the mystery was more romantic than the truth. Eleanor was fond of possibilities after all. Once she spent 7 years painting imaginary maps of cities that didn't exist. By 1793, villagers recalled seeing her sitting by the window at dusk, holding a letter up to the light, her eyes skimming its seal, never its contents. When her cousin asked why, she simply said, "Knowing there's something there is enough for now." The final letter arrived in December 1801. She placed it atop the stack, untied it, then gently tied them all back together with a thicker ribbon, blue velvet. When Eleanor passed in 1810, the letters remained untouched, not a single seal broken, not a single word read. A historian once read them all in 1937 and published a study titled "Love Deferred, the Blythe Mystery." But the book was so full of footnotes and weather context that most readers fell asleep before reaching chapter 2. And so Eleanor's unopened romance lingers, not in passion or heartbreak, but in the silence of possibilities, unchosen, unread, and unspoiled. Here is Tea Leaves and Ink Stains, The Courting Rituals of Colonial Madras, 1789. The monsoons had just kissed the edges of Fort St. George in Madras in 1789, when a curious English custom began blooming among the palm-lined verandas of the East India Company settlement: teacup courting. A practice so gentle and repetitive, so unhurried and utterly predictable, that even its participants often forgot they were courting at all. It began with a porcelain cup, delivered each morning to the garden of a particular bungalow owned by the Percival sisters, Margaret and Edith. The cup would rest on a saucer precisely 11 centimeters in diameter, always placed facing east. Inside was a folded note, written in indigo ink on handmade linen paper. Not poetic declarations of love, no, just questions like, do you suppose crows feel jealousy? Have you ever wept over a compass? Is cardamom a comfort or an intrusion? These questions were never signed. The handwriting, however, betrayed its author, a young assistant mapmaker named Lionel Tisbury, whose lowercase g's curved like sea waves and whose ink occasionally smudged where his fingers trembled. Every morning for 147 days, the teacup arrived. Every evening, one of the Percival sisters, never revealing which, would leave a reply in the same cup on slightly thinner paper, often accompanied by a dried petal or half of a clove. Their handwriting was always printed in block letters to mask their identity. By day 52, Lionel asked whether stars could be forgiven for being late. By day 79, the sisters responded, only if they whisper apologies. The entire affair became known among house staff and nearby traders as the slowest romance on earth. But no one intervened. In fact, many encouraged it by polishing the cup or trimming the hedge near the garden to give the suitor more space. The romance unfolded entirely through these small exchanges, without names, faces, or direct contact. For nearly 5 months, their intimacy grew, measured not in glances or touches, but in the precise language of folded paper and cautious curiosity. On day 148, the cup did not arrive. No note, no question, just the cup, upside down and inside it. A simple seashell, smoothed by years in the tide. The sisters never wrote again. Lionel, as recorded in a logbook from the map office, took leave for health of spirit and returned to England, where he eventually became a lighthouse keeper. It is said he kept the last seashell on his desk until the day he died, and thus ends another chapter in romantic history, where the heartbeat of love was barely audible, the tea always slightly oversteeped, and the climax never quite arrived.
The Bridge Letters of Prague, 1803. As dawn spilled gently over the cobbled banks of the Vltava River in the spring of 1803, something very peculiar began happening on Charles Bridge in Prague. Every morning, just as the church bells of St. Nicholas chimed 6 times, a folded letter, always sealed with plum-colored wax, was found wedged between the stones of the statue of St. Luthgard. The city's shoeshiners and milkmaids noticed first, then the bakers. Eventually, it became routine, this quiet act of anonymous correspondence. The letters were written in Czech, French, and once in accidental Latin. Each began with the same line: to the one who still looks up when it rains. No one saw who left the letters, and no one knew who collected them. But every morning, the old letter would be gone, replaced by a new one. This went on for 8 months. Each message described in excruciatingly gentle detail the same fictional afternoon that never happened, a walk across the bridge, 2 shadows merging in the light, the scent of cinnamon drifting from a nearby cafe, the touch of hands at the edge of a railing, the long silence afterward, watching the swans. But each retelling differed slightly. Sometimes the shadows were taller. Sometimes the cafe served poppy seed cakes instead of cinnamon rolls. Sometimes the touch never happened. Yet the longing remained consistent and slow. So slow it felt like the past was waiting for the future to remember it. Eventually, a young librarian named Klara Novakova began documenting the letters. She collected 198 before the final one arrived in early December. It read, "I no longer wait at the bridge, but I still remember the rain on your eyelashes." After that, the statue remained empty. Clara bound the letters in a blue cloth and kept them hidden in the basement of the Clementinum Library, where they still rest. Never digitized, never fully translated. A romance, composed entirely of imagined afternoons and unshared glances, lives silently in Prague's stone heart. Slow as time, quiet as dust. The ink-stained lovers of Kyoto, 1691. In the year 1691, within the soft hush of Kyoto's Gion district, there lived a calligrapher named Etsuro, who wrote poetry for mourning families, not for fame, not for money, but because he believed grief was a language too often written badly. Every day he sat beside the small wooden window of his rented room, brushing ink across rice paper with the precision of a man carving prayers into water. His neighbors rarely spoke to him. His meals were simple, his robes always grey. But across the street lived Sayuri, a kimono stitcher whose laughter, rare as it was, made even the lanterns tremble. She noticed him first, always alone, always brushing, always bowing to cherry blossoms that had already fallen. One afternoon, without truly knowing why, she left a folded note on his window ledge. It said simply, "If ink is your voice, teach me how to speak sadness." Etsuro said nothing. But the next evening, a delicate brush and a square of blank paper appeared at her door. No message, just waiting. So began a courtship not of conversation, but of calligraphy. Each night, she would leave a word in brushed black on his ledge. The next night, he would answer with a stroke of his own, sometimes a phrase, sometimes just a kanji, so old even the temples had forgotten its name. Their letters became slower, more poetic, less language, more ache. Months passed, seasons shifted. Neighbors noticed ink stains on Sayuri's sleeves that she never tried to wash away. They never met in daylight, never spoke aloud, never crossed the street. But one spring evening, after the cherry trees had begun their slow dance toward the ground, no letter came. And the next night, still nothing. And the next. Sayuri waited with the patience of someone who understood that real sadness does not rush. Then, a week later, the window across the street stood open, empty. Inside, a single scroll lay resting on the calligraphy desk. It read, "My hand is tired and my sorrow full. But if silence could hold you, I would be louder than love." Sayuri never married. She kept the scroll. And each year,
On the same spring night, she would sit by the window in her faded robes and leave a blank square of rice paper on her sill, just in case ink remembered how to return. The Empty Teacups of St. Petersburg, 1839. The winter of 1839 in St. Petersburg was not one of great revolutions or palace dramas. No assassinations, no poets dying by duel. It was merely a cold season, quieter than most, where the snow fell with the precision of a metronome, and the carriages moved like hesitant thoughts through icy boulevards. In a modest townhouse near Nevsky Prospect, an elderly widow named Madame Katya Morozova maintained a peculiar tradition. Each morning at precisely 9 o'clock, she would set 2 teacups by the frosted window, one for herself, one for Alexei, her husband, who had died 16 winters ago. She never missed a day, even when the samovar broke, even when she was ill, even when she knew the tea would grow cold before a single word was spoken. Alexei had been a watchmaker, not a famous one, not particularly gifted, but he had been patient, and he had once told her that love was like a watch's spring, tight, hidden, necessary. He died with his spectacles still balanced on the tip of his nose and a broken pocket watch in his hand. He'd been trying to fix it for weeks. Katya never wound that watch again. She simply placed it in a velvet box next to his cup each morning. To those who passed by her window, the sight became familiar. The cups, the silence, the stillness. A boy once asked his mother, "Why doesn't the other person ever drink their tea?" And the mother answered, "Maybe they do, just very, very slowly." One snowy evening in February, a young postman named Mikhail brought Katya a small package. No sender, no return address. Inside was an antique key, delicate, engraved, and clearly for something very old. That night, for the first time in 16 years, Katya opened Alexei's velvet box, and to her surprise, the key turned. The watch ticked, once, twice, then stopped again. She smiled, and the next morning she only set out one cup. People noticed, but they did not ask. Even silence in St. Petersburg deserves its privacy. The Pianist's Letter in Vienna, 1852. In the heart of Vienna, where gas lamps flickered like cautious waltzes and horse hooves echoed down narrow alleys, a forgotten letter once rested beneath the warped floorboards of a music hall that no longer stands. The letter was never sent. Its ink had faded into sepia whispers. But its story, though boring to history books, was the kind that lovers remember long after the music ends. Clara Eberstein, a pianist of moderate acclaim, played 6 nights a week at Café Edelweiss, a modest hall known for strong coffee and weak applause. Her fingers were reliable, technically sound, emotionally distant. She played what was requested, nothing more, until December 5th, 1852. That night, a stranger entered the cafe, wearing a dark wool coat, a red scarf, and a memory Clara had buried beneath 5 years of routines. His name was Anselm Becker. He had been her teacher once, and her scandal, and her almost. They had parted in Berlin after a letter he never wrote and a decision she never forgave. Now he sat in the back of the room, not clapping, not smiling, just listening. And Clara, for reasons unknown even to herself, chose not to play what was written. She improvised, a slow waltz in B minor, soft, hesitant, like a confession whispered behind gloved hands. When it ended, there was no applause, only silence. Anselm nodded once, then he left. The next morning, Clara found a folded letter beneath her piano stool, dated 1847, never sent, unopened, from Anselm. She never told anyone what it said, but she stopped playing B minor after that night. She also stopped checking the audience for familiar faces. Years later, when the cafe burned down, the letter was found again, brittle and unreadable. It was tossed into a pile with broken keys and ash-covered sheet music. And that was the end of that particular note in history. Or the pause, perhaps, a rest between movements. The train to Oslo that never arrived, 1881. Some journeys don't end, some just disappear. In the chill of January 3rd, 1881, a modest steam train left the Gothenburg station in Sweden, bound for Oslo, then known as Christiania. It was an uneventful route, a 4-hour trip past pine forests, frozen lakes, and sleepy towns that didn't care much for visitors. Train number 94, they called it. 2 passenger cars, 1 freight, a total of 16 souls on board, including the conductor, a retired baker, a honeymooning couple, and an author nobody read. The train departed at 9:04 a.m. sharp. It was never seen again. The weather was clear, no record of derailment, no broken tracks, no witnesses. The line was searched repeatedly. Villages were questioned. Not a single splinter of the train was ever found. By spring, the story faded into something between folklore and clerical error. Some blamed snowdrifts, others said the conductor had run off with the baker's luggage. But deeper stories whispered something else. There was a small stop called Lufheim, marked only by a rusted sign and a single abandoned platform. It was decommissioned decades earlier but still appeared faintly on older maps. The train was scheduled to pass it at exactly 10:47 a.m., and it did, according to an old station worker named Ingrid Madsen, who swore she saw it from her cabin window. But she said it wasn't slowing. In fact, It was speeding up. She described black smoke, not steam, and an odd green hue behind the windows. The passengers looked asleep. Ingrid died in 1907, still convinced the train had passed through something she called a rift in the frost. Nothing was ever confirmed, but each winter, around the same time, railway workers along that stretch still report hearing a low whistle in the distance. Faint, steady, fading into pine. History dismissed it, but the time log at Gothenburg station still lists train 94 as in transit.
you